Hello and welcome to PROMAC once again for our session on the SATs. Today we will be tackling a few of the problems or few of the areas that are identified as part of the writing abilities. Alright, now the writing component on the SATs carries Now this comprises not only your multiple choice but also your essay questions. Now multiple choice questions, that is the writing ability multiple choice questions, deals with essentially grammar component, whereas the essay question, as we know, deals with your writing of the essay. The entire writing ability is rated in the range of 200 to 800. That means your writing ability score falls somewhere within this range. So we opt for a median of 500. So if we are looking at a median of 500, what we actually mean is there would be 50% of the students who are performing above 500 range, and there would be 50% of the students performing below the 500 range. Depending on what kind of proficiency you have gained in your grammar points and also in your presentation of your essay, you can be assured of a certain score. Right. Now, if you take the grammar points, we will come to the essay at a later point of time. But for now, we will take up the grammar component and see what exactly is tested and what is the question format. Now, on the SAT, the grammar component is divided into two parts. One is where you're looking at sentence improvement, and the other is the error identification. Now, the testing points are the same for both the types of questions, but the way it is tested or the manner in which it is tested is different. Now, if you look at sentence improvement, you get 11 questions of sentence improvement plus 14 questions. Error identification, you get about 18 questions. So totally, we are looking at 25 here and 18 here, so therefore 43 questions. The other 6 questions is paragraph improvement. Now, the paragraph improvement questions are not drastically different from the sentence improvement questions. They are almost the same in that they test you on the same points. However, the format of paragraph improvement questions are different, though they are testing you on the same points, and also a couple of questions might test you on the structure of the paragraph. That means they can give you an additional sentence, for example, and ask you to fit it somewhere in the paragraph. They ask you to find a place where the paragraph might take in that particular sentence, or where the sentence can be incorporated logically without disturbing the sequence of the paragraph already given. And for that also, we need to be aware of the same testing points. Right. So, since we are talking about the testing points, what exactly is being tested on sentence improvement and in error identification? There are a few grammar points that are tested. Now, for example, if you take the first and most common type of error that you would be tested on would be subject-verb agreement, or in this case, since there could be an error, it is subject-verb disagreement. most of the questions on the SAT writing ability will focus on subject-verb disagreement or subject-verb agreement, as is the case, though sometimes you're not directly tested on the subject-verb agreement or disagreement, but you are tested on a point that hinges on the subject-verb agreement, or something that hinges on your identification of the subject and whether the identification of the verb that is given goes in tandem with the rest of the sentence or not. The other more common error is modifiers. You can also call them participles or dangling modifiers. Apart from this, sometimes there are tricky tense errors. Most of us are unsure of whether it should be a has or whether it should be a had or whether there should be a was or an are, depending on how we perceive the sentence. So that's why we call it tricky tense errors. Now, there would be issues of parallelism. That is how you perceive the sentence to be balanced or imbalanced. Now, when we talk about balancing a sentence or imbalance in a sentence, we are basically talking about whether the logical structure of the sentence is the same throughout or not, whether there is any kind of jarring note in terms of the different components of the sentence. Now, apart from parallelism, you can also have idioms that are tested. Idioms or idiomatic expressions. Idioms or idiomatic expressions do not have rules per se, but most of the time your sense for language tells you whether a certain question is right or a certain word is right in the context or a certain tense is right in the context. Now, most of the time on the SATs, you do not require to substitute or rather give the correction as such, but unless you know that there is an error, it would become very difficult for you to identify, okay, there is an error here or not. And for that reason, idioms or idiomatic expression or proficiency with idiomatic expressions is very much required. Now, unfortunately, idioms or idiomatic expression is only stylistics of language, and there are not many rules associated with this. So it's only with some kind of practice and with some kind of familiarity with language that you would be able to correct your idiomatic expressions. Now, apart from this, we also have the pronoun antecedent error. So that means the pronoun and whatever subject precedes, does it agree with it or not? Apart from the pronoun antecedent error, we might also have errors dealing with comparisons. Whether the comparisons are logical, whether adjectives and adverbs are used correctly, whether the proper comparative form is being used or not, whether things are being compared in the way that they should be compared or not. And then you will have problems with redundancies. What exactly do we mean by redundancies? Redundancies are areas wherein a particular sentence uses words unnecessarily. Those are areas of redundancies or unnecessary use of words. If we are to take an example, a very small example to highlight what redundancy is all about, because this word may not be really familiar to some of us. So redundancy is, for example, if you have a sentence like, suppose I were to underline just this part of the sentence. Because of inflation, prices rose up. Now, if you were to look at the sentence only in terms of the redundancy element, you would see that there is an unnecessary use of a certain word. Now, when you say rose, which means rise, or when you say up, it's basically the same. So, you do not say prices rose up. You only say prices went up, or you say the prices rose. So, as you can see, redundancies are not very easy to identify simply because we are more used to speaking in this manner. To us, this does not count as redundancy at all because we are trying to emphasize. In our mind, we are trying to emphasize a certain point, and therefore we are saying prices rose up. So in our mind, there is an emphasis, which on the SATs, especially on the writing section of your SAT, this would count as an error. So redundancies are not very obvious. You will have, sometimes there will be a problem identifying where the redundancy is. Now, apart from redundancies, there would also be irregular tenses or irregular pronouns that are used. Now, these are comprehensively some of the errors that are tested. Now, minor points that would be tested would be, say for example, we would be tested on our knowledge of appositives. Now, we would not be tested directly on what an appositive is, but unless we identify what an appositive is, the other components of the sentence may not be very evident to us. There would be maybe some problems with prepositions. Now, we know some time back I did mention to you idioms and idiomatic expressions. Now, prepositions play an integral part in that. Now, prepositions do not only mean idioms or idiomatic expressions, but also other areas which can be very crucial to scoring better on your SATs. So, prepositions are also integral, though they may not be overtly tested as prepositions. Irregular verbs could be one of the areas that are tested. That's why we have called them tricky tenses. So minor points could also be tested, but major points are these 9 points. Now, for example, moods can be tested. Now, when we're talking about moods, we have 3 moods, like we know. We have the indicative mood. We have the subjunctive mood. We have the imperative mood. But let's not bother too much about the technicalities involved here. On the SATs, what are tested? On the SATs, very rarely they test you on the subjunctive mood. The other ones, they are fine. Why subjunctive? Because subjunctive uses the if clause. That is hypothetical situations. Now, wherever if clauses are used, there would be room for tenses to be tested. Now, should it be if I was or if I were? Now, this kind of element can be tested on the SATs, and that's why subjunctive mood could be considered to a certain extent. But if you make the study of moods as an integral part of your study for SAT grammar, then that would be misleading, because this is one of the minor points, not the point that is being tested there. All right. So some points like the moods could be also tested at times. Now these are the testing points. How are these tested? These are tested in 2-3 different ways, like I've listed earlier. One is sentence improvement. The second is error identification. These are the major points. What exactly does a sentence improvement question look like? A sentence improvement question will have part of the sentence or whole of the sentence being underlined, along with 5 answer options. Now, depending on whether you think there is an error or not, you will be able to make a choice. Now, the sentence improvement question format, part or whole of the sentence is underlined. Now, is it necessary that the entire sentence should have a fault? Maybe sometimes there are errors, but 1/5 of the time there are no errors. Alright, so part or whole of the sentence is underlined. Underlined portion may or may not have an error. Now, both in sentence improvement and error identification, as I've told you, the same kind of testing points are there. Now, very often there are a lot of misconceptions associated with what is actually correct and what is not correct. Now, even if you sit in the ocean of grammar for the next 20 years, there would be still some points which are debatable. So, given that factor, and since SAT tests you on some points and in a certain definitive manner, it pays to understand that what points are commonly misinterpreted, what points are perceived, because these points seem to be in clash with what we have learned in, say, middle school. For example, in middle school, our teachers have told us, do not begin a sentence with because phrases are all wrong or because clauses are all wrong. But obviously, if you can begin a sentence with a because, it's not always necessarily incorrect to begin a sentence with a because, especially not so on the SAT. But I have seen about 85-90% of the students of the SAT think that if a sentence begins with a because, necessarily that would be incorrect. Now, that would be a very wrong notion to carry over, because you could have SAT sentences that begin with a because and still be correct. So, do not assume that just because a sentence begins with because, it is necessarily incorrect. There are other parts of the sentence which also need to be assessed to decide whether the because clause or because phrase is correct or incorrect. Now, given the fact that the other portions of the sentence are correct and the because clause could be correct, the sentence could be termed as a no error, or the sentence could be right as it is. So, be careful of sentences that begin with a because. Do not assume that a because phrase is always incorrect or a because clause is always incorrect. Now, some of us also have this notion that SAT does not accept which whenever there is a choice with that. Now, stylistically speaking, there is no difference at all between that and which. An SAT never tests you on whether that is correct or which is correct. In other words, you will never get a question which says all factors are the same, the only difference is that or which. Now, there is no such kind of testing point on the SAT. That or which, both, given that the other factors in the sentence are correct, either of the answer options may be correct. Either of the words may be correct. Alright, so necessarily the presence of which does not guarantee an error. So just don't take that part of the sentence which has a which as saying, okay, this part must have an error because it uses a which instead of a that. Not necessarily so. Who or whom? It's not the same as him or he. It's easier to identify whether we have to use a he or a him, but most of the time, who or whom, not easily identifiable, and there is no blind case rule which says that if it's a who, it is correct, if it's a whom, it is incorrect. Both have their own rules. So do not jump to conclusion saying that it uses a who, so therefore it is right or incorrect. it uses a whom, so it can't be correct or it can be correct. Same goes with including that. What is the meaning of that? Here we will term it as the case of missing that. Now say for example, if you have a sentence like, this is the ball I lost yesterday. Now some of us might be tempted to say, this is the ball that I lost yesterday. Now with or without this that, the sentence is correct. There is no difference at all. So the case of missing that, now we would be tempted to put in a that there because in our minds the sentence reads more appropriately if we include the that, but it's not necessarily true of the SAT. This is the case of the missing that. So be careful about incorporating a that. Maybe it is necessary, maybe it is not. Most of the time, an unnecessary that would only ruin the coherence or the logical structure of the sentence. Now, the next factor is where we have to plus infinitive. That means to be form. Now, the to plus infinitive are separated with an adverbial. Now that may or may not be. Split infinitives are not tested on the SATs. So if there is a phrase like this, go with it. There is nothing wrong in it. Split infinitives are not one of the testing points of the SATs. You would never see a sentence which is split like this. So don't be too worried about infinitives and split infinitives. They will take care of themselves. You take care of the other points. Now, what are the other points that we are looking at? Now, for example, if we are to look at subject to verb agreement. What about this first sentence? There is more than 30 students in this class. Would you say the sentence is correct? Or should it be, there are more than 30 students in this class? Now, we will not discuss any rules here at this point of time, but I would suggest go by what you feel is correct. What do you feel is right? Does there is more than 30 students in this class sound right? Or there are more than 30 students in this class sound right? Because students is there, obviously are sounds right, so this part is correct. Now, this kind of sense for language is what is there with you as a student who is acquainted with English. So don't try to test that too much or push it to an extent and then start wondering about it should be is because there is singular because there can never be a subject. If that cannot be a subject, that can never correlate. Then there's no point in correlating. Simply being a noun or a pronoun is not necessarily a rule for you to go because there is a pronoun. It does not necessarily mean that it would be also a subject. All right. The club requires their members to fill the form. Now what is happening here? Should it be their members or should it be its members? Now there are two elements that you can look at. You can look at the subject and say club is singular, so it can't be pronoun there. Or if you have thought, okay, club can be many people put together, it can be one entity, or it can be, a plural. If you're confused about that, look at the verb. This is a singular verb. So obviously, whatever pronoun follows should also be singular. So the club requires its members to fill the form. Right? So, very basic kind of errors. There are no particular grammar rules that you need to recall. This goes with the flow of the sentence or with your sense for language. The store changed its ownership several times over the last decade. Now here there's a time frame that is mentioned. Now when there is a time frame that is mentioned, what should be the verb? Last decade. So therefore it has changed, not simply changed. Now this also tells us that the verb that is being used should also be in a certain form of tense, and when we learn tenses, this could be one of the areas that would pose us a problem. Unlike the first sentence, wherein the feel for the sentence is more important, or the sound of the sentence becomes more important, and even without knowing most of the rules, you would still be able to come up with the correct part of the sentence that needs to be corrected, which is not so evident in this part of the sentence. You would say, okay, the store changed its ownership. Okay, fine, it looks fine. But then if you take the time component that is mentioned, so you need to have a tense form to complete the sentence. So such kind of gradation of errors, there are some times errors that are easily identifiable, and sometimes there are errors which are not so easily identifiable, which is the reason why certain amount of proficiency in the rules of grammar have to be, I wouldn't say memorized, but you have to develop a skill at, you have to develop the proficiency in analyzing what is required where in terms of the points that are being tested on the SAT. But never challenge a sentence simply for the sake of challenging it, in spite of knowing that something that sounds right or something is right. All right. Yes, that's why we call this type of error as tricky tense error. They are tricky tenses simply because they are not very evident. We didn't call subject-verb disagreement as a tricky subject-verb disagreement simply because they are more evident. And since they are a major testing point on the SATs, you would be in a good place if you are more comfortable using some of the rules that are required for you to analyze some of the factors given on the exam. Now, given the factor that this is the format of the exam, you would also like to look at the structure of the error identification question and structure of the sentence improvement question. Now, sentence improvement question, like I have told you, whole of the sentence or part of the sentence is analyzed. There are 5 answer options. 5 answer options are given, of which option A is always a repeat of the underlined portion. It is always a repeat of the underlined portion. That means if you think that there is no error in the sentence, then you simply choose option A. That is for the sentence improvement. In case you think that the original sentence has an error, then one of the answers might be B, C, D or E. Of these 4 answer options, obviously one is going to be correct. One answer is overcorrected. That means the original sentence or the original errors are corrected and there's a new error that is incorporated. Then you will have one answer that may be undercorrected. That means if a sentence improvement question has 3 errors, maybe one of the answer options is correcting 2 evident errors and leaving 1 error uncorrected. So that means the original format of the sentence is partially corrected and the part of it is still remains the same. And one answer option can be in passive voice. Now, not all passive voice sentences are necessarily incorrect, but most of the time on the SAT, if there is a passive voice answer option, you need to recheck and double check to see if there is not an active voice sentence which can state the same idea in a much more efficient manner. So we would tentatively say that one of the answer options could be passive voice answer option, given the fact that the correct answer option can be an active voice sentence. If there is no active voice sentence correction, then the passive voice sentence can be taken as correct. So one answer may be passive voiced. Now I repeat again, it is not that all passive voice answer options would be incorrect, but by and large, if there is no active voice format type of correction in the sentence improvement, and there is only a passive voice type of correction that is done, then that passive voice is correct. But in the case of where an active voice sentence correction is there and there is a passive voiced correction, the active voiced correction should be chosen simply because it will eliminate any kind of redundancy that might be there. Because passive voice necessarily prolongs a sentence or it makes a sentence lengthier. So if you go by one of the basic rules of the SAT of minimum possible correction and economy of expression rules, then passive voice sentences in comparison with an active voice sentence can be unacceptable. So to list out the basic parameters by which you would choose an answer for the SAT would be where there is a minimum possible correction of the original sentence, at the same time also adhering to the rule of economy of expression. All right. Now, to summarize what we have just learnt in today's class. Today's class was about the testing points of the writing ability. Some of the testing points we have listed out, like say for example, some of the testing points are subject verb disagreement errors, maybe there is an error of parallelism, maybe there are modifying errors and so on and so forth, followed by the sentence improvement question format. That is, part of the sentence or whole of the sentence may be underlined, followed by error identification question format. 5 different parts of the sentence are underlined. 5 parts of the sentence are underlined. One part being no error. So if you think that the other 4 parts do not have an error, then you should choose the no error part of option E here. Now, apart from this, there are 2 rules that we need to keep in mind when we are doing either sentence improvement or error identification. There are 2 rules that we need to keep in mind. One rule is economy of expression. The other rule is minimum possible correction. Now, minimum possible correction, if we are looking at, we will look at in terms of the question and how it is framed. Error identification, individual parts of the sentence are underlined. If you think that the individual part is correct in lieu of the rest of the sentence, then you retain it and go for no error, which is always answer E. If there is no error in sentence improvement, it's always answer option A. Keeping these things in mind, we need to now elaborate on the individual testing points in the rest of the sessions. In the next session, we will take up one of the grammar points and look at various examples and how it is tested on the SATs and how you need to gain a proficiency on that particular point by taking a few sentences. So see you in the next class.